Father TED Talks, and today we'll be speaking about death. So, having been off for about 3 weeks, taking a little bit of a break here at the end of the summer, and now starting up again right after the ecclesiastical new year, I want to talk about a subject that most people kind of don't really want to talk about, and that is death. This is not really a question that has been sent in by our listeners or our viewers through our Facebook or our Gmail account. This is something that is kind of personal and dear to my heart, because as a priest, I've noticed that over the past few years, and maybe even perhaps decades, but especially in the last most recent years, we have seen kind of a very, I would say, dangerous and scary trend when it comes to the issue of death within the Orthodox Church. And what do I mean by this? I mean that amongst most of our Orthodox Christians, at least in my experience, in my ministry, most of our people don't really know much about death. And I don't mean the dying experience, although that's a different topic for a different video podcast at another time, but rather what we do as Orthodox Christians, the traditions that we have, and what we do when someone passes away, one of our loved ones leaves this life to meet the Lord, and how we go through that process of grieving, the rituals that surround a person's death within the Orthodox Church, and why they are important. And so I want to take this time to talk a little bit about that, because I think it is really, really important, and I'll tell you why. So I want to basically approach the topic from 3 different points of view. One of them will be about how the Orthodox view death and how we approach it from a theological and spiritual point of view. The second will be some of the disturbing trends that we are seeing in our modern day in regards to death. And also the third would be the proper burial traditions that we have as Orthodox Christians and why they are important. So the first thing that we have to say when we speak about death as Orthodox Christians is we need to talk about the resurrection, because for us, this is the most important thing, that while we do all go through death, we all will face our physical death. This is only one part of a 2-part equation, that first there comes physical death, but then there comes the great hope and joy of the resurrection. This is what we celebrate every year at Pascha, Easter. It is the death and resurrection of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So it is really important to remember that, and we will pay attention that if you ever go to Orthodox funerals, we always have these really strong resurrectional and joyous symbols of the resurrection. You notice that when at an Orthodox funeral, priests always wear white, because that symbolizes the light of the resurrection. They should never be wearing dark colors. We always place an icon of the resurrection beside our loved ones on the casket as we are greeting them and saying goodbye to them. We always cover them with a white burial shroud, which always represents the light of Christ, and usually that burial shroud has a beautiful icon of the resurrection on it. So we have all these traditions that really drive home the resurrection. And the reason why I start with this part of theology is because many of us, we kind of fall into, the secular trap of seeing death as, the thing to be feared and the thing that is the ultimate enemy of us. It used to be the enemy in the Old Testament because Christ had not come yet. Christ had not conquered death by death. But for Christians, death is not the enemy, but rather the way by which we take up our cross and we follow Christ to the end, to his glorious resurrection. And so it's interesting to note that all the feast days of the church, pretty much all of them, except some of the feast days of Christ and the Virgin Mary and maybe even John the Baptist, we never celebrate any of the saints on the day that they're born. We always celebrate them on the day that they die. We always celebrate on the day that they leave this earth. And the reason for that is that we believe as Orthodox Christians that birthdays are not all that important. We really haven't done anything when we come to the world. If anything, our parents did all the hard work. Our mothers did all the hard work bringing us and birthing us into this world. But when we leave this world, when we leave this life, that is when we show the quality of the types of people that we are, what kinds of Christians that we are. Are we good people? Are we people that have lived a truly Christian life? And so it is at the end of our earthly lives that we truly celebrate that icon of Christ that is within us. And so this is why when we have the feasts of the saints, we are having these big panigyria, these festivals that happen in the old countries of Greece and in other Orthodox countries. But even here we have these festivals, or we have the festivals of our churches that are named after our patron saints, and we are truly having fun, listening to music, dancing, eating and drinking and enjoying ourselves, and we are doing this on the day that the saints have died. So that's a really, really important point to remember, because it is very, very easy to get caught up in the sadness of death without remembering the joy and the transition into what comes next. Now, what's interesting is that the second part that I want to talk about is about how many of our own Orthodox Christians are kind of following the secular understanding of death. That death is simply, the disposal of the body is dying, the spirit is going somewhere, it is floating up to God, or it is not essential or not important to the spiritual reality. And so many people are doing many different things. And so part of this is that there is a movement away from the church. There are a lot of Orthodox Christians, believe it or not, that are looking for convenience, and so they are actually requesting to do the funeral services away from the church, to do them at funeral homes or at cemeteries and visitation areas, so places that are not the environment that we would call the Orthodox Church. And this is usually done for convenience. This is sometimes done out of laziness by family members of the deceased who may not be very devout Orthodox Christians, not understanding that all the services of our church, whether they are sacraments or non-sacraments, everything that we do revolve around our Orthodox faith. And so the locus for all those activities happens here at the church. We are born here, we are married here, we die here. And so it's extremely important to do our Orthodox funerals inside the church, not in other foreign places which are devoid of any kind of spiritual context. So that's the one thing. Another thing that a lot of people are doing now, unfortunately, is that a lot of Orthodox Christians want to cremate their dead. And this is an extremely popular trend that is happening now. Why? Because it's cheaper, and so people are looking to save money from the burial services, and also it is a type of out of sight, out of mind way of not dealing with or coping with death. So instead of kind of having to see a body, say goodbye to a body, to have a viewing, to come face to face with death, to come face to face with the loved one that we have lost, many people opt to cremate them, to burn them, and to dispose of the body that way. And then usually they get together somewhere, maybe a few weeks later and have a celebration of life or something like that. Of course, there are also other extreme kind of traditions that are happening that are not Orthodox, like using urns or colored sand, making pendants out of our loved ones and strange things like that. And it's while it's not extremely common within the Orthodox Church, it is becoming a more common thing. And so all this kind of betrays a type of movement towards a secular understanding of death, that we are desacralizing death. Instead of seeing it as not only a celebration of the struggles of that person and an honoring of the icon of Christ in that person, even in the state of death, and also an exhortation to prayer and to remembrance, and also a statement of belief in the afterlife and belief in the resurrection, we begin to kind of push all those things away, and we opt to bury our people in foreign environments such as funeral homes and cemeteries, or cremate them, get rid of them, so that we don't have to think about them, we don't have to go through the unpleasantness of actually mourning. So these are some of the things that I've seen, that I've noticed, this kind of movement away from the church by some people, but not the majority, but it is becoming a bigger problem within the church because people do not see the process of grieving, the process of mourning, the process of burying our loved ones as an integral part of the Orthodox lifestyle, as an integral part of the healing process, an integral part of the understanding of ourselves and of our own impending deaths, and how we need to come to terms with that, and by being able to pray over our loved ones and say goodbye to them, that we too are preparing ourselves for that final journey. So the final part of this video, I wanted to touch on some of the burial traditions that we have as Orthodox Christians that, unfortunately, a lot of our Orthodox Christians do not even know about them. I find that many of my parishioners, when somebody passes away in their family, they are at a loss of what we do and, what needs to be done. And so they either are asking me many questions, or they don't ask any questions at all and end up, kind of following a secular way of doing, a quote-unquote celebration of life as opposed to an actual Orthodox funeral. So here are some of the guidelines that we need to know when somebody passes away. First of all, before that person even passes away, if somebody is sick or if we know that they have an impending death, the priest should be notified immediately. We should know that somebody is sick and somebody is terminal way before they come to their final moment, so that the priest has time to come in and to pray with them, to give them a chance to confess their sins, to be able to speak to the priest, to get advice, and to just basically spiritually prepare them for their moment of transition. A lot of times this doesn't even happen. We get called in at the very last minute because people believe that, the idea of last rites, quote unquote, is something of a magical thing, that as long as we can get to communion to these people before they die, then they will go to heaven. But this is really not the Orthodox understanding, is that we are there to counsel that person and to prepare them for their transition. Of course, as they reach the end, they should be communing and being anointed with holy oil and things like that. But after they pass away, the priest should be called immediately so that he may come and do a trisayun prayer, which is basically the basic prayer that we read for the dead as soon as the soul has left. And this is something that can be done by the bedside of the person who has recently passed. It is also done at viewings, usually the night before the funeral service. So people should really be calling the priest as soon as somebody dies, either way. Having said that, after the person has actually passed away and the appropriate prayers have been read, there is a proper Orthodox process to preparing a human being for the funeral service. Now, living in North America, a lot of the Orthodox Christians who came here just followed suit with what everybody else was doing. And so we see here that most Orthodox funerals kind of follow the same secular pattern that everybody else does, which means that basically a funeral home picks up your loved one, takes them to the funeral home, embalms them, prepares them, dresses them up, puts makeup on them to make them look alive, places them in a casket, does the viewing at the funeral home, and then goes to the church and does the funeral. And after the funeral, there is the interment, the burying of the person. Now, from an Orthodox point of view, there are a few problems with this. Number one is that we believe as Orthodox Christians that it is extremely important to have time with the body after somebody dies, to be able to have time to pray, to have time to cry over the person, to be able to begin that mourning process. So the idea of only spending a few minutes after the person has passed away and then kind of being ushered out of the hospital or out of the hospice or wherever the person is so that the professionals can come in and whisk them away, I think that is something that is not very healthy for us. So one thing that would be, because this happened in the village, is that we would have the body at our homes in the old times, and the person would be cared for by their families. They would be washed by their family, they would be dressed by their family, and they would be buried as soon as possible. Now, of course, in our modern day, sometimes that's not possible, especially living in big cities where we have people traveling larger distances, sometimes people coming from out of town, and it is difficult to be able to bury somebody within the next 24 hours or even sometimes 48 hours. And so we are forced sometimes to embalm. Now, embalming is not really that great because we see it as a violation of the human body. Fluids are drained, the blood is drained from the human being, and they are pumped full of chemicals in order to basically preserve them, basically to make them almost like a type of doll, so that they can look almost alive and preserved, for the viewing. And so this is not really good for us from an Orthodox point of view. We should not be embalming our dead, and yet we do it sometimes out of necessity when time does not permit us. But the ideal would be that we would do a funeral within 24 to 48 hours where the body can keep and we can actually still do the funeral. Now, having said that, the other thing that would be, I think, ideal would be that, we should always have a basic casket, something wooden, something that will decompose, because the whole theology of the Orthodox Church is that we are going back to the earth. We are going back to the elements from which we came. So we want the person to decompose. We want the person to go back into nature. This is the theology of the Church. And so we do not want to have metal caskets or things that are difficult to break down. We want biodegradable things. So you want to have a simple casket, a very plain casket. And another thing is that a lot of times cemeteries will try to sell what are called vaults or liners, cement liners or metal vaults, which are basically kind of like big boxes that are placed, in the ground and where the casket goes into them in order to preserve the casket. Now, usually this happens because it is sold to the people that, we don't want the casket to cave in. We don't want your loved one to be destroyed in the ground. But of course, from an Orthodox point of view, we understand that the whole point of burying somebody in the ground is for them to disintegrate into the ground. And so you want the casket to cave in. You want it to break down. You want that person to go back into the earth. And so kind of putting them in vaults or entombing them in kind of like, different preservation methods is not really an Orthodox thing to do. And so I think we shouldn't be doing it, and we should stay away from those things. Of course, as I mentioned before, the idea of cremation should be rejected because we believe that the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, even when the soul leaves and the body is now simply an empty shell. We do not just dispose of it. We still reverence it. This is why we sense it during the funeral service. One of my former professors and now dean of St. Vladimir Seminary, Father John Baer, has a very beautiful quote that he says. He says that in today's day and age, we live as hedonists and die as Platonists, which basically means that, during our lives, we do everything for our bodies. We go to the gym, we eat the right types of food, we enjoy ourselves, we live for pleasure, we live for health, but then when we die, we dispose of the body as if it's nothing. So, because the Platonists believed that the body is the tomb of the soul and that it means absolutely nothing. We don't believe that as Orthodox Christians. We believe that the body is an integral part of that image of Christ, that the image of Christ within us is both the body and the soul, and so we reverence both of them, even when temporarily the body is broken, the body is dead. We know that it will come back, and so we reverence it. We do not actively destroy it by fire. And so all of these things, kind of bring us to the point where we understand that when our loved one dies, we should always A, have time to mourn, B, if the family can be involved in the dressing and the anointing of the person along with the priest reading prayers, that would be good. C, if we can avoid embalming, would be good. D, if we can avoid, very superfluous and expensive caskets and things like that, or liners, or vaults and things like that will preserve the body in the ground. We should avoid those things. And E, we should definitely avoid cremation. All those things that we should do for our loved ones in order to ensure that their bodies are respected and they are disposed of in the most beautiful way possible in the Orthodox tradition. Now, there are, of course, other traditions that also surround the burial rituals. The boiling of wheat, the koliva, as we call it in the Orthodox Church, which symbolizes death and resurrection, as Christ uses the example in the Gospel of John, where he says right before he gets arrested that a grain of wheat, unless it falls into the ground and dies, cannot produce a new plant. And so we use the koliva and we sprinkle them within the casket as our loved one is as the casket is being closed, right after they've been covered with a burial shroud. We pour oil and wine in, which are the fruits of the earth, and usually we also bake a prosphoro, an offering bread that we take to the church so that our loved one is commemorated in the next divine liturgy. So we do those traditions as well, and those are important for the family to participate in, to make their own koliva and to make their own prosphora, not to be ordering them from stores or bakeries and things like that, so that it is part of that mourning process of caring for the dead, caring for our loved ones. So we do those things as well, and all of this is part of this kind of liturgy of death that we have within the Orthodox Church. And I know this, using these terms of liturgy of death, caring for the dead, even using the word dead today can seem a little bit morbid. Maybe some people think that this whole video podcast, this episode of Father TED Talks that I'm doing is morbid. It's kind of a downer. And, I doubt there'll be much views on YouTube for this particular episode. But be that as it may, these are some of the most important things that we need to pay attention to. I think that the trends are in the opposite direction, that people are not paying attention to these really, really important traditions. We are not only losing our traditions, the respect for the dead, but also we are losing our ability to mourn properly. And so I hope that this video has helped at least identify some of the dangerous trends away from the traditional understanding of burial, and also has helped some of you to know what to do when somebody passes away, how to take care of them. And of course, if you want more information about that, there is also a link on the screen below to a really beautiful book called A Christian Ending, by Deacon Mark Barna and his wife Elizabeth, who have written a beautiful book called A Christian Ending, which has to do with the proper Orthodox understanding of burial of a Christian and how that is to be done. And so I would recommend everybody to kind of take a look at that book because it's really, really good. Again, I thank you all for being here with us, and this is Father Ted for the Father TED Talks. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next week. Take care.